Today, we're making the last minute Leslie. A quick sewing pattern designed for those last minute moments when you need a stylish accessory. This pattern will be your go-to solution for a perfectly matched crossbody. There aren't a lot of pieces for this bag and very minimal hardware. You will need your front panel, 2 lining pieces, slip pocket accent, D-ring connectors, back panel fleece interfacing, your back lower panel, back upper panel, flap lining, and your flap. For hardware, you'll need 2 D-ring connectors, optional nameplate, and an optional magnetic snap. For the strap, I recommend a chain connector because it's easier once we're finished. If you don't have one, that's okay. There are instructions for us to complete a vinyl strap, but you will also need 2 swivel connectors and 2 6mm rivets. Also recommended a couple scrap pieces of interfacing for backing our hardware. At the beginning of the written pattern, I give you instructions for a few marks that we want to make on a couple of the pieces. There'll be markings on our exterior back upper panel, on our lining pieces, and how to get perfect corners, where to place the interfacing on our front panel as well as the corners, and how to do the corners and point of our flap. As well, there are markings for your tag and magnets that will need to be transferred onto your pieces if you choose to do those options. For the strap, I've added double-sided tape just a little bit more than 1/8 inch from the long raw edge, and we're going to fold over hot dog style, lining up those raw edges all the way down the strap. Because this is designed to be a quick sew, I do have it left raw edge, but you can also paint with edge paint for a more finished look if you have extra time. If you have your Joleelee Creations strap rivet guide, we can just line that up right to the end and use markings B and C. If you don't have one, you just want to make sure that they're evenly spaced on both sides. So mark C and B, punch our holes. Repeat on the other side. So line up our guide to the end. Fit nice in that middle dashed line. Punch our holes. Take one of your swivel hooks, slide it onto your strap, fold it over. We're going to add our rivet through both of the holes. Add the back, and then set that in place. Repeat for the other side. Slide our swivel on, fold it over, add our rivet, through both holes, add the rivet cap, and set the rivet in place. And then our strap is complete. So we can set that aside for now. Now we want to work on our slip pocket. And if you're running out of time, we don't really need a pocket, but everybody loves pockets. So we're going to fold it in half, right sides together, meeting our longest edges. we're going to stitch along both sides here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once we have it stitched, we want to trim these corners so that when we flip it right side out, it takes out a majority of the bulk. So I get my scissors just as close as I can to that stitch line and trim at an angle outwards. So just like that. Then we need to fold this pocket right side out. So I stick my finger in to the pocket and push with my thumb, flipping that pocket right side out. So same with this side. Put my finger inside, my thumb finger meets with that finger, and we just flip that right side out. So once that's flipped, you can give it a good press if you'd like to get all the wrinkles out and line everything up along the side. If you need to, you can poke these corners out a little bit more. Then we can baste this top closed here. So now we have our slit pocket here, and we have a slit pocket accent. I gave you in the instructions to draw a 1/2 inch line down from the top of our accent. It is not going to be in the middle, it's going to be slightly higher towards the top. To add double-sided tape on both sides of this line, and if your pocket is directional, this is where it's going to matter the most for your slit pocket. We want this part here to be what you would want to see on your slit pocket. Remove the double-sided tape and then take your pocket and flip it over, lining up this line to your edge here of your pocket. So now this is what would be the inside of the slit pocket, and this side would be what we would see from the inside of the bag. So this will be our 1/2 inch, and then our longer side here. So I do that so that once we fold this to the back side, when we top stitch on our accent, we make sure we catch the back side. No one will ever notice that that back side is a tad bit longer, but we'll be able to catch the stitching without falling off on the back side. So now we're going to top stitch along the top and bottom of this accent. Once we have it top stitched, we can go ahead and trim off any excess that's hanging off over the edge past our fabric. Now we want to grab one of our lining panels and mark the mark that is given in the pattern and line up our slit pocket to that line that we just drew, centering it on the pocket. If you need to, you can add some tape to hold it down, but now we just want to stitch it onto our pocket, starting up here in the top corner, stitching down the side, across the bottom, and back up. And I like to make sure that I back stitch really well here at the corner so that when you're putting things in and out of the pocket, it doesn't pull on it. So now we have our slit pocket stitched onto our lining piece, and if you'd like to divide it down the center, you can. I like to leave mine open so that I have a pocket for my phone. We're going to grab our other lining piece, and this one has our markings drawn on it, and we're going to add a couple clips to keep this one in place. And we're going to stitch our lining together. We do want our lining to be a little bit smaller seam allowance than, or I guess a larger seam allowance than our exterior so that it fits in nicely, and we do need to leave a hole for turning. So I'm going to start my stitching up at the top, come down around the corner, and stop just past that curve where we met our bottom seam allowance line. And so I'm going to stop here. Going to leave this area open, start again at the bottom of this curve, go up the curve and back to the top. So this one here, we're going to start at a 3/8 inch seam allowance and go about an inch down, and then gradually move over to our 1/2 inch seam allowance. So it's going to look something like this. We want to take our pinking shears and go around these curves. It'll help it lay a little bit better once we put it into the bag. So we can snip that. And we want to leave this seam allowance full so we can tuck it in. We can take some of this seam allowance down here, and I'm just going to go right up below or right at that curve that we left, and just meet that stitching at the bottom. So right in here, and just leave that top portion there. So your lining should look like this. We can now work on our flap. For our flap, we have our lining piece and our exterior. We already added our nameplate on the exterior and our snap on the lining piece. So let's put those right side together. And I'm going to stitch everything with this lining side up where we drew our seam allowance. And I like to move it to a smaller stitch length as we go around the curves, and that'll just keep the fabric from pulling through in a nicer curve. Just like we did for our lining curves, we want to use pinking shears or trim small triangles around these curved areas. We don't need to trim any of the seam allowances here because it is already small. So we can go ahead and just turn this right side out through the top long opening. If you have a cotton lining, you can take it over to your iron and we can press this down. If you have vinyl on both sides, you may want to use some clips to get everything rolled over nice and neat on the corners. So just make sure to poke this out and kind of roll that lining just on the back side of the seam so that when we stitch it, it doesn't poke out from the front. So we have the seam for our flap and our lining nice and pressed out and clipped together. I'm going to top stitch around the sides, the bottom edges, and the top. And if you've made sure that your nameplate and your magnet are installed, if you're doing one, we can baste the top closed. Now we'll need our exterior back lower panel, our exterior back upper panel, and our flap. We're going to take our flap, and it's easier if we find the centers for this flap. And we'll find the center for the bottom lower panel. Take your flap and we're going to put it lining side up. Line up those center marks and we can baste this together here. Once that's basted together, we want to take our exterior upper flap, and this is the top edge here with the markings. We're going to line up the bottom edge without the marking, making a flap sandwich. So we have our exterior bottom, our lower part, our flap, and then the upper part. So this line should be at the top. We're going to line up the bottom edge right there like this. And we're going to stitch that together. Once this is all stitched together with a flap sandwich, we want to lift up our flap and this upper panel. Fold your seam allowance down towards the lower panel. So when you flip it over, it should look like this. I'm going to crease this really well. So we want this going downwards, not up. And then let's top stitch on the lower panel just under the flap. And now we have our exterior back panel. We need to attach our interfacing now. So we're going to take that back panel fleece, center it on the back panel and align it with that line that we drew on the upper panel at the beginning. And go ahead and carefully fuse this on. Make sure to use a Teflon sheet if you have one to protect your vinyl, and just avoid your hardware up top and just fuse this on. Self-adhesive fleece is another option that you could use. Now that we have our fleece onto our back panel, we need to add our front panel. We can line these up right sides together, lining up the bottom edge and those curves. Add a couple clips. And we can stitch that together following the seam allowance in the pattern. Just like we did on the lining, we want to trim with pinking shears on the bottom corners, and we can trim the bottom seam allowance here and up the sides. Just make sure to leave the top inch full. Before we move on to the final construction, we need to make our D-rings. So take your D-ring connector and add double-sided tape to each side of a line that we drew down the middle. Peel off the backing and fold towards that center line. Repeat for the other side. We're going to peel off that backing and meet that long raw edge to that center line. And now we need to top stitch down each side of the strip. With your strip top stitched down both sides, you're going to fold the short edges and match those up, and we're going to cut this in half to make two different connectors. It's just way easier to stitch down the sides and assemble it when it was one long strip instead of trying to put together two strips. Take your D-ring, and we're going to put that folded side, or like the wrong side, towards the flat edge of the D-ring and match those raw edges together. Can add a clip to hold those in place. And the same thing for this side. We need to mark about 3/4 of an inch from this raw edge and put a line across. Same thing for this connector. From the raw edge, about 3/4 of an inch down. Just want to make sure they're even on both of those. And now we can turn our exterior right sides out. Take your flap and fold it back up against the body out of the way. And we want to butterfly open these side seams. And we want to add the connector D-ring down on the exterior, lining up this line that we drew to the top edge of this bag. So we can clip that there. And then we want to baste that in place and do the same for this other side. So butterfly open the side seams, D-ring connector facing towards the bottom of the bag, line up the line that we drew, and baste that in place. Basting can be tricky, but you just open up the bag wide and push everything out of the way, just making sure to only stitch along that line that we drew near D-ring connector. Just a couple stitches is all you need. I'm going to find the centers of my exterior before we assemble it, so we need to line up these side seams and the D-ring connectors, and this will come out to a point. So that will be our center of our front panel. And we can do the same for the back. So line up these side seams, flat back, line up these side seams here, and then where this comes to a point is our center mark. Same thing for the lining. Grab your side seams, match those up, pull it out to the side, and where this lines up is your center point. Same thing for the other side. Line this up, pull it out to the side where it lines up. It's your center point. Fold your flap all the way open so that it's right sides together. So this is the magnet here, and your flap's all the way open against that back panel. We're going to stuff the exterior into the lining, and I want my flap side to be against my slip pocket. So just stuff that in. And if you need to, you can reach through the bottom and kind of pull that flap through. And we're going to line up these side seams. So our D-ring connector and our lining. So fold open that lining and match that up with that side seam and add a couple clips. Then I'll do the other side seam. So I'm lining up that D-ring connector to that butterflied lining side seam. And add a couple clips. And then we want to line up the exterior center with the lining center. So we'll do that over here. So sometimes making the little V notches will help line things up a little bit better, just so you can see it. So same thing for this side, you may have to like kind of adjust it over. So grab that there and add a few clips. Okay, so now that I have a couple clips, I can stick my hand inside the bag and kind of finish manipulating it to line up the exterior edges and the lining edges the best I can. So I'm going to take, now that these center marks are lined up, I can kind of push this out because your exterior is bigger than your lining. So you're going to have a little bit of extra material, it seems like, but once you push it out, it'll line up. So just kind of expand it around and add clips. If it's wrinkled inside, that's okay. We just want that top 1/4 of an inch-ish, 3/8 of an inch to be straight. So then I'm just working myself around this bag. Same thing for this side. Kind of pushing my hand in, pushing the bottom, pushing it around as much as I can to smooth that top edge and make it as flat as I can up against the lining edge. So add some clips. And just keep working yourself around the bag until there's clips all the way around the bag. So once we have clips around the entire perimeter, we can stitch this down at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. When you get to these side connectors, you may need to add a piece of vinyl or use a hump jumper. Even with an industrial machine, it's good practice to get in the habit of using one of those just in case. Let's pull this bag and turn it right side out through the bottom opening. So usually like to start with the flap, then you can kind of grab the exterior and gently pull that through the opening first, and then that lining will flip right side out. So you should have your exterior, your lining, and your flap. Stick your hands through the lining, pushing out that exterior bottom, rounding out all the corners, and straightening out your lining. Push out your bottom seam corners, and then you will have your opening here. We need to close that up. So I like to take my fingers and kind of just gently tug on the stitching that's there, and this will kind of roll inwards. Once it rolls inwards, naturally you can line up those folded edges. Kind of roll those in together. So add some clips along the bottom to keep that closed. So you can make sure everything is all lined up on both sides. If you need to adjust it, just kind of roll it under. So we want that edge to be even. Okay. Then we're going to stitch from just before that opening, so a couple stitches back, across the bottom, sealing that hole. Take your lining and tuck it back into the exterior. Push out those corners well.
those corners in really nice and neat. And now I want to kind of roll and press this seam together, lining up the edge of the lining and the exterior. So I'm going to add a couple clips as I go around, and this will keep the top stitching nice and neat, and that way you don't see the lining from the outside of the bag. So just kind of roll and push that seam down. Make sure our D-rings are pulled out nice and tight. And with any thick seams, especially these connectors, by squeezing that seam, it just kind of pushes everything together and reduces the bulk just a little bit. Keeping the flap open and out of the way, we can top stitch around the exterior. And that's how quick and easy this last minute Leslie is. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I can't wait to see your version of this pattern. Please tag me on Instagram and Facebook if you make it, and I hope it helps you when you're in a time crunch and you really need something special to match your outfit. Bye!